Will Warhammer The Old World be too expensive? Now, the obvious meme answer to that is yes. You will have to remortgage your house. You will have to sell a kidney. You will have to make some kind of deal with the devil for your soul. Like, they're the jokes that you do something drastic to afford the incredibly high prices of Games Workshop. But I think Warhammer The Old World has a couple of special things relating to it that possibly make it too expensive even for your average wargamer. So let's talk about them. Firstly, right now we have a world situation called the cost of living crisis in the UK. I don't know if it's called that everywhere else. But basically geopolitical events have caused prices to rise, inflation to go up, a recession to loom. Let's face it, mainly Russia invading Ukraine, right? And now with this, I'm not saying that Games Workshop are at risk. I don't think they have anything to worry about just yet. We'll maybe talk about that another day. They have said that the luxury product is generally recession proof. We'll see how true that is in the coming months and years perhaps. But what's important is a luxury hobby might mean that more people get priced out than normal because of the cost of living situation. If you're spending more on your gas and electric, then you're possibly going to spend less on your miniatures. Now obviously what is expensive and not expensive to some is very subjective. If you're a millionaire, for example, well then you can probably just about afford one army. Obviously that's a joke, but you get the point. A millionaire probably won't think twice about buying armies in Warhammer if they want to do that, whereas somebody, say, on minimum wage might have to be a bit more cautious and think a bit more clearly about what they're spending their money on. I'm not actually saying there's a right and wrong answer here to what is too expensive or not. I do personally think that Games Workshop are slightly overpriced, and I think they can get away with that because they are the dominant market leader and the competition isn't that strong in compared to them. But that's sort of irrelevant here in a way. The key point here is just that if people are less well off, then even an averagely priced wargaming army might be too expensive for some people now, as it wasn't maybe a couple of years back, so it might be too expensive for them. And that's understandable. And there's a bit of a risk that if Games Workshop start feeling a bit of financial pressure as well, maybe they will actually increase their prices yet again. And that in turn means more people can't afford an army. More people won't start buying a Warhammer Fantasy army because they don't have the disposable income to start. If this game launched now, it might actually be significantly affected by that, by the world situation. But if maybe it launches and there is no recession, then it would be not affected by that. So we'll see what happens basically. Now I do think Fantasy has a couple of other issues. Now I haven't done an exact statistical count here about model counts, so I don't know what I'm going to say here is technically true, but it definitely felt like it to me. It seemed to me that Warhammer Fantasy generally required more models than say other games. Now I can't really compare that to 40k or Age of Sigmar because I've never really played those games, but in the last edition of Fantasy, or the latest editions of Fantasy, it wasn't untypical to see unit sizes of 30, maybe even 40 models just in one unit. I'm talking there, not the entire army. And if I compare that to a game that I know quite well like Star Wars Legion, some entire Star Wars Legion armies are literally like 30 models strong, which is the equivalent of one unit in Fantasy, which in general, in my opinion, it seemed to make a game like Star Wars Legion cheaper than a game like 40k. I did once do the stats there and I found that the cost per model was generally about the same. The main difference was that Star Wars Legion typically used less models, therefore it was cheaper. Now I've obviously no idea what Games Workshop are planning with unit sizes when it comes to the old world. I personally don't want to see the horde units return. I don't want to see units that are like 30 man or 40 man big. I don't really like that. I generally preferred unit sizes where it's like 20 or 25 and you have maybe 3 or 4 blocks of that. But even that, if you have 4 blocks of 25, you have 100 minis. So that's not going to be cheap. So look, I don't really know what Games Workshop can do there to keep the model count down. The less models you need, the cheaper the game will be. But why do they have an incentive to do that? They obviously want you to buy more models. So it's a very tricky thing for consumers there. I hope we don't see like massive units being required. Granted, nothing is required unless you're trying to be competitive, but I just want to see an average army be an average number of models that is sort of reasonable. Personally, I would be okay with Games Workshop, and I don't think they're necessarily going to do this, but I would be okay with them doing simpler models, maybe static poses or, you know, push fit or something like that. Models with less variety, just so they can try and keep the cost down. I would be okay with that, but I mean, there'll be some hobbyists that are like, no, I really want my 500 piece models, and like, fair play. I get you, it's your choice, you do you. But I think typically you're going to need a lot of models and that's going to cost you. And one thing I think we're possibly going to have to factor in at some point to these conversations is 3D printing. Some of you out there will be 3D printing happy as Larry, fair enough, but the cost of a 3D printer, I don't exactly know. You can probably get one in the UK maybe like for 170 quid. Then you need the resin, then you need the 3D models. That still probably ends up cheaper than buying a full army from Games Workshop. And then if you print a second army, well then it's definitely cheaper. Obviously, you're not going to be able to take those to like official tournaments, but I do think more and more people are going to start doing that the easier and cheaper 3D printing gets. How much of an impact it will have on fantasy? Well, let's wait and see when fantasy launches. Keep calling it fantasy, the old world. So yeah, defining if something is too expensive is a bit of a fool's task, right? It's obviously subjective. I do think that Games Workshop will be more expensive than their competitors like Mantic, etc. I do think you are sort of paying a premium for quality, though I also believe that the competitors are very, very close to Games Workshop in terms of quality at the moment. The differentiator is very minimum, but in a way you are sort of paying for Games Workshop's brand. However, I also think that Games Workshop brand will become less important the more that wargaming decentralizes, and I think 3D printing is going to do a bit of that. So yeah, I think for an average person, a old world army will be quite expensive. If that's too much for you or not, then I have no idea. I can't really answer that. I do hope that Games Workshop try to keep the expense down to try and make it so that we get more people as possible. I don't think Games Workshop have the intent to do that though. This is sort of seen as a niche game, and I'm pretty sure they're going to try and milk us, especially in a sense, people like me. I'm effectively the perfect audience for this. When I initially played Warhammer Fantasy, I wasn't that well off. I didn't have that much disposable income. Now I'm older, I do have a mortgage, a wife and a kid, so I'm not exactly minted, but I can probably budget £300-400 a year for my little miniature wargaming hobby. I suspect that's who they're planning on taking the money from, and I think they'll succeed. Let's hope they don't go insane though with the pricing, and let's hope this game is going to be relatively popular. We'll see about that though. If you like this video, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Have a most beautiful day. Goodbye.